In the cold, sterile light, where the air hums with the silent, oppressive drone of filters, stands a lone plant, resembling a living, alien candelabrum. Its leaves, of a perfect, almost mathematical symmetry, are dotted with myriads of tiny crystals, sparkling like diamond dust under a merciless surgical lamp. Each of these trichomes is a microscopic factory, a chemical laboratory, assembling molecules in absolute silence, capable of rewriting consciousness, soothing unbearable pain, or birthing monsters from the darkest, locked corners of the mind. This is not a field herb, not a weed brazenly breaking through asphalt, but the crown of agro-technical creation, a child of science, nurtured with doses of photons and nutrients measured out by the hour. Its life merely a graph on the cold glow of a monitor. Here, in this glass prison, its genetic code is deciphered and displayed on a screen as endless strings of 4 letters. Its chemical composition is broken down into the peaks of a chromatographic spectrogram, its potency measured with microgram precision, its ancient mystery transformed into cold, soulless data. This plant is the perfect prisoner, nameless, yet possessing a power capable of toppling empires or healing the suffering, a god and a demon, trapped in a test tube. But to understand how this distant descendant of a wild steppe grass found itself in this technological sanctuary, how it journeyed from a nomad's food to an object of worship, from a ship's rope to an ounce weighed on police scales, we must journey backward. We must return to the misty, pre-literate past, into the dust of millennia, where the first human hand touched its serrated leaf not with a scalpel in a latex glove, but with a calloused palm, roughened by want and hunger. There, in the boundless steppes of Eurasia, under a low, leaden sky, the piercing wind carried its seeds, and they fell into the dry, ungrateful, cracked soil, promising only struggle. It was just one among many, a stubborn, sinewy stalk reaching for the meager sun, still nameless, devoid of laws and curses, simply a part of the silent, indifferent plant world. It was valued not for its hidden, unknown chemistry, but for its coarse, tangible physics, for the fact that its fibers, soaked in icy river water and beaten soft with a smooth stone, turned into the strongest rope. Its seeds, ground between 2 stones into a coarse, earth-smelling flour, saved people from starvation during the long, blizzard-howling winters, and the oil, pressed from them with a primitive press, provided a meager, sooty light on dark nights full of primal fear. No one yet thought of reality-altering smoke, only of a rope that could hold a wild horse, of fabric that could protect from the icy wind, of a handful of seeds that could fill an empty, cramping stomach. This primal utilitarian magic was the first unwritten chapter in its endless, bloody, and triumphant saga. Ghostly imprints of woven fibers on millennia-old pottery, found in a shattered shard, an echo of a long-decayed net. Charred seeds in a layer of ash at the site of an ancient hearth, silent witnesses to a long-extinguished fire and a sated hunger. Fragile fabric fragments, decayed in the frozen tombs of great warriors, still holding the ghost of a human touch. These are the silent, irrefutable pieces of evidence of its slow, almost imperceptible entry into the human world, of its growing into the very flesh of civilization. Hemp was not a conqueror. It was a fellow traveler, a companion, a shadow that followed the first settled tribes. It appeared in archaeological layers from Neolithic China to the kurgans of Scythian chiefs, becoming a part of human daily life. Its domestication was not an act, but a process, a slow, selective dialogue between plant and human. This dialogue, stretching over centuries, was dictated not by a stroke of genius, but by daily, monotonous need. The weaver's hand instinctively selected the tallest, straightest stalks for the perfect, continuous thread. The healer's hand, covered in scars and stains from herbs, carefully saved the seeds of those plants that yielded the stickiest, most fragrant resin for his healing ointments. These unconscious decisions, dictated by chance observation, generation after generation, carved two different paths into the plant's genome. Thus, from a single wild ancestor, two entities were born. One, industrial hemp, stately and fibrous. The other, cannabis, squat and resinous. Two twin brothers, one a builder, the other a mystic. One raised walls and moved ships. The other tore down the walls of consciousness and sent the spirit on journeys. This profound duality would become its essence, its strength, and its curse. Listen to the echo locked in the earth. In the lowest soils of the Yellow River Basin, where Chinese civilization was born, archaeologists find fibers and seeds 6 or even 8,000 years old. For the Yangshao and Hemudu cultures, it was as basic a tool as a flint axe or a clay pot. Far to the west, in the icy embrace of the Altai Mountains, the Pazyryk tribes left entirely different traces. In their frozen tombs, next to mummies covered in intricate blue tattoos of beasts and spirits, are found not only ropes, but also bronze censers with the remains of burned seeds and flowers. Under a microscope, these remains still hold the ghost of a smoke that was not for warmth, but for ritual. A smoke that was meant to be a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a guide for the chief's soul on its final journey. And then, at the beginning of our century, the Taklamakan Desert, this ancient sun-scorched corridor of the Silk Road, gave up its greatest secret. In the looted Yanghai tomb, among disturbed bones, scientists discovered a leather bag in which lay almost a kilogram of perfectly preserved, carefully selected cannabis. It was buried with a shaman about 2,700 years ago, and it was his greatest treasure, his tool. Laboratory analysis stunned the scientific world. This plant was incredibly rich in psychoactive substances. These were select female inflorescences, cultivated for a single purpose. It was not a byproduct, but the primary value. People here purposefully cultivated the plant not for its fiber, but for its ability to speak with spirits, to carry consciousness beyond the visible world, into the unseen landscapes of the inner cosmos. Long before Herodotus described the Scythian steam baths, here, in the heart of Asia, smoke was already a deliberate technology for journeys into other realities. The shaman from Yanghai was not just a healer, he was a cosmonaut of the inner world, and cannabis was his ship. The father of history, Herodotus, observing the Scythians in the 5th century BC, described them with the astonishment and slight disgust of a civilized ethnographer. He saw how, in cramped felt yurts, they would throw hemp seeds onto red-hot stones, and inhaling the thick, fragrant vapor, howl with pleasure. To a Greek, it was a barbaric curiosity, a sign of savagery and lack of self-control. But for the Scythians, it was a sacred ritual of purification, a way to achieve a battle ecstasy before a fight or to escort a chieftain into the afterlife, surrounding him with a cloud of sacred smoke. Later, science, with its love for order and classification, would attempt to force this chaotic, multifaceted plant into the strict framework of taxonomy. In 1753, Carl Linnaeus, the great systematizer of all living things, would give it the name Cannabis sativa, cultivated hemp, describing a tall, fibrous plant common in Europe. A few decades later, French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, studying specimens brought from India, would identify a shorter, bushier, and more resinous species, Cannabis indica, Indian hemp. He noticed what was obvious to any Indian peasant. This plant was different. Its strength lay not in its stalk, but in its flower. These two names, sativa and indica, would become milestones, but they merely reflected what nameless farmers and shamans had known for millennia. Modern genetics would confirm this intuitive wisdom, revealing two main genetic lineages diverging from a common ancestor, one selected by humans for its strength and length, the other for the power and depth of its effects. The history of this plant's use is a history of human needs, written in the language of things. The fiber was everywhere. It was the hidden infrastructure of the ancient world. From it, twine for fishing nets was twisted, coarse but durable shirts were sewn, and reins were woven for the first domesticated horses, which changed the course of war and history. When man built the first ships, it was hemp ropes and sails that allowed him to conquer the seas, connecting continents and empires. Roman galleys, Viking longships, Chinese junks, Columbus's caravels, all were literally stitched together with hemp thread, their movement dependent on the wind caught by hempen canvas. The fate of empires hung on these coarse fibers. In China, they learned to make paper from old hemp rags and fishing nets, fragile, rough sheets on which the first laws, poems, and philosophical treatises would be written. The plant's memory was woven into the very fabric of history, becoming its material medium, a silent keeper of human thought. The seeds and oil were food and light, the prose of life. A handful of roasted seeds, rich in protein and fats, was a satisfying snack on a long journey or during a lean winter. The oil burned in clay lamps, dispelling the primordial darkness in caves and huts, allowing people to work, tell stories, and see the faces of loved ones after sunset. But alongside this prose, there was always poetry, the dark, sticky, aromatic resin on its flowers. This resin, which released its secret power when heated, would become its destiny, its glory, and its curse. In the hot valleys of the Hindu Kush, on the terraced fields of Nepal, on the slopes of the Caucasus, people for centuries selected the plants with the densest, most resinous buds. These glandular trichomes, full of terpenes and cannabinoids, were the source of what the Arabs would call hashish, grass, and the Hindus, charas. The distinction between industrial hemp and narcotic cannabis was forged not by nature, but by human need and climate. Sails and ropes in one region, ritual intoxication and medicine in another. Knowledge of the plant's two faces spread through the veins of the ancient world, the trade routes. The Silk Road was not just for silk. It was an artery through which flowed seeds, recipes, beliefs, and words. Sanskrit, Banga, Chinese ma, Greek cannabis, Arabic hashish. Each word was a notch left by the plant on the body of language, a marker of its journey. These words traveled in the saddlebags of merchants and in the memory of physicians, for whom a library was a pharmacy and an ancient text, a guide to action. Recipes for ointments, tinctures, and powders, translated from Greek to Arabic, from Sanskrit to Persian, became the foundation of global pharmacology. These ancient texts are the next room in our narrative, filled with the scents of dried herbs and the rustle of fragile parchment. Medicine writes its history slowly, grinding myths, observations, and accidental discoveries into knowledge. In China, this history is as old as the empire itself. The legendary emperor Shennong, the divine farmer, according to legend, personally tested hundreds of herbs to determine their properties. In the herbal Shennong Ben Chao Jing, attributed to him, one of the world's oldest pharmacological texts, Cannabis Mao, is mentioned with respect. Its seeds are food, its root a remedy for blood stasis, and its flowers a treatment for possession by evil spirits and loss of connection with reality, which was likely a euphemism for pain relief during primitive surgical procedures. Later, great Chinese pharmacologists, such as Li Shizhen in the 16th century, would describe its use with encyclopedic meticulousness as a laxative, a diuretic, and a component in plasters for relieving joint pain. This was the view of a pragmatist, for whom the plant was merely a tool in the apothecary's chest, devoid of a mystical aura, but possessing measurable benefits. In their works, there was no fear, only the cold observation of its effect. On the Indian subcontinent, the plant's history is rooted in sacred texts, where it is inseparable from the divine. In the Vedas, humanity's most ancient hymns, Bhanga, is mentioned as one of 5 sacred plants bestowed upon humans as a source of joy and for liberation from anxiety. The Atharva Veda directly calls it an herb that helps dispel fear and alleviate suffering, a protector against disease and evil, a plant in which a guardian spirit resides. In the canons of Ayurveda, the Karaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita, cannabis is described as a powerful therapeutic agent with a broad spectrum of action. The great surgeon Sushruta, whose texts are striking in their precision, mentions it as part of wine-based anesthetic mixtures that allowed for complex operations, from rhinoplasty to cataract removal. Here, the plant is not just a tool, but a gift from the gods, demanding caution, ritual, and reverence. In Egypt, in the famous Ebers Papyrus, dated to 1550 BCE, among hundreds of recipes for all ailments, from crocodile bites to depression, scholars find mentions of the plant Shemshemet. Many linguists and botanists today are confident that this is indeed cannabis. It was used in suppositories to treat hemorrhoids, in poultices to relieve eye inflammation, and, most strikingly, as part of mixtures to ease childbirth. Thousands of years ago, physicians on the banks of the Nile already knew of its analgesic and antispasmodic properties. The Greeks and Romans, those great compilers and pragmatists, also did not ignore it, although they were wary of its psychoactive properties. Dioscorides, a military physician in the army of Emperor Nero, in his fundamental work, De Materia Medica, recommended a decoction of the hemp root for earache and made poultices from its seeds to relieve inflammation. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, described in detail the strength of hemp ropes, the benefits of its seeds, and its medicinal properties, noting that the plant's juice could expel worms and other creatures from the ears. The great Galen, a systematizer of ancient medicine who lived in the 2nd century AD, valued cannabis as an analgesic and anti-inflammatory agent, but warned that excessive consumption of its seeds could lead to hot and poisonous vapors. The logic of physicians of that time was simple and empirical. If it helps, it should be used. Knowledge was passed from teacher to student, from legion to legion, along the paved roads that connected the empire into a single organism. When Rome fell to the barbarians, its scientific knowledge did not perish. It was taken up, preserved, and multiplied in the Islamic world. In the 9th century in Baghdad, in the legendary House of Wisdom, the works of Galen and Dioscorides were translated into Arabic, becoming the basis for a new medical revolution. Great physicians such as Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, included cannabis in their medical canons, which for hundreds of years would become handbooks for doctors from Cordoba to Samarkand. Avicenna, in his The Canon of Medicine, described it in detail as an effective remedy for pain, edema, gout, and even migraines, specifying precise dosages and preparation methods. The 13th century Andalusian botanist Ibn al-Baitar, in his monumental work, The Comprehensive Book on Simple Medicines and Foodstuffs, described dozens of ways to use hashish and hemp, which he had collected during his travels throughout the Islamic world. Apothecaries in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad prepared tinctures, oils, and ointments from it, carefully measuring the doses, for they knew how fine the line is between medicine and poison. It was an era when the plant was part of high science, an object of study for the best minds of humanity, and not the subject of police reports. While medicine sought to measure and weigh the plant's power, religion and ritual sought to use it to break through to other worlds. There is something sacred in the smoke itself, its ability to fill a space, alter perception, and then disappear without a trace, leaving behind only an altered state of consciousness. Archaeological finds in the kurgans of the Scythians and Pazyryks confirm the accounts of Herodotus. Traces of cannabis are found in braziers, which was burned during rituals, perhaps before battle for a combat trance, or during a chieftain's funeral to communicate with the spirit world. It was a technology of ecstasy, a way to talk with the gods or ancestors. On the Iranian plateau and in India, the ritual history of the plant becomes even more complex and profound. Debates about what the legendary soma in India or hauma in Iran was, a divine drink granting immortality and visions, continue to this day. Many scholars are convinced that one of its key components was cannabis, mixed with ephedra and other herbs. By the Middle Ages in India, it became firmly associated with the god Shiva, the destroyer, and the creator. Bhanga, a drink made from milk, spices, and ground cannabis leaves, became an integral part of religious festivals, such as Holi. Sadhus, wandering ascetics, smoke ganja, flower buds, from clay pipes called chillums, seeking to achieve enlightenment and detach from worldly vanity. In the Islamic world, the attitude toward the plant was far more contradictory and tense. The Quran explicitly forbids alcohol, khamr, the intoxicant, but says nothing directly about cannabis and hashish. This gave rise to centuries-long and fierce debates among theologians. Some Sufi brotherhoods, especially those that practiced ecstatic rituals, dhikr, saw hashish as a way to quickly achieve mystical union with God, Fana. The Persian poetry of Rumi and Hafez is full of metaphors of wine and intoxication, which many researchers believe concealed the very real use of hashish. However, Orthodox ulama fiercely condemned it, calling it the devil's weed that leads to laziness, depravity, and the neglect of religious duty. The legend of the Hashishin, assassins, a Nizari sect whose leader Hassani Saba supposedly drugged his warriors with hashish to instill blind devotion in them, is a vivid example of medieval propaganda that used the plant as a symbol of heresy and political threat. This story, brought to Europe by the Crusaders and Marco Polo, created a sinister image of the plant for centuries. Thus, throughout the ancient and medieval world, cannabis lived a double life, reflecting the duality of man himself. In the hands of a physician, it was a medicine. In the hands of a priest, a key to the divine. In the hands of a warrior, a source of fury. And in the hands of a poet, a metaphor. It was a tool for working with boundaries between life and death, pain and relief, reality and illusion. Its power lay in its duality, and it was this duality that made it simultaneously so alluring and so dangerous in the eyes of different cultures. The material culture of the ritual was no less important than in medicine. The resin, charas, was collected by slowly rubbing the sticky flower buds between the palms until they were covered with a dark, viscous, precious coating. Bhanga was prepared by women in families, passing the exact recipe from generation to generation. Every ritual, even the most ecstatic, had its own rules: timing, dosage, incantations. Sacredness was not accidental. It was the result of labor and knowledge. In these two hypostases, as builder and mystic, the foundation of the economy and the key to the transcendent, the plant entered the modern era. The age of discovery was the age of sale, and therefore, the age of hemp. Imagine the shipyards of Amsterdam, London, or Seville in the 17th century. The air is saturated with the acrid smell of resin, tar, and hemp dust, which clogs the lungs, causing a dry cough. Rope walks as long as streets, where workers pace back and forth, twisting fibers into ropes the thickness of a grown man's arm, their muscles strained to the limit. The deafening roar of looms producing thousands of square meters of coarse but incredibly strong sailcloth. This entire gigantic mechanism, which allowed European empires to ensnare the world with their trade and military network, depended on this simple, unpretentious plant. The Spanish Invincible Armada, the ships of the Dutch East India Company, the British Royal Navy, their power directly depended on uninterrupted supplies of hemp. Entire regions, from the Russian plains to the Italian provinces, were integrated into this global economy. Peter the Fiern, creating the Russian fleet from scratch, issued decrees encouraging the cultivation of good hemp and severely punishing the supply of low-quality raw material. English kings granted monopolies and subsidies for hemp cultivation in the American colonies, compelling farmers, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, to devote their best lands to it. Louis XIV's finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, considered control over hemp production a matter of national security, no less important than gunpowder or iron. It was the oil of its time, a strategic resource over which trade wars were fought. The logistics of this empire of fiber were astonishing. Vast fields where peasants grew and retted hemp in foul-smelling ponds, rivers along which barges carried the raw material to ports, huge warehouses where it was stored for years, and shipyards where thousands of hands transformed it into rigging and sails. It was the foundation of the economy, solid and material. But the 19th century brought with it steam and steel, which began to slowly kill the empire of hemp. Steamships, puffing smoke, and not dependent on the whims of the wind, gradually supplanted the elegant sailing ships. Steel cables proved stronger and more durable than hemp ropes. Eli Whitney's cotton gin made cotton much cheaper and more accessible for the textile industry. And the invention of a method for producing cheap paper from wood pulp in the mid-century dealt the final blow to hemp as an industrial giant. Its empire began to crumble. But as one story was coming to an end, another began, more complex and controversial. Along with colonial soldiers, officials, and merchants, knowledge of the plant's second, psychoactive face returned to Europe and America. In 1839, the Irish physician William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, who was working in Calcutta, published a revolutionary article in a scientific journal. He discovered with astonishment that local doctors were successfully using cannabis extracts to treat tetanus, cholera, rheumatism, and convulsions. After conducting his own experiments on animals and then on humans, he concluded that it was a most valuable medicine, undeservedly forgotten in the West. His work caused a sensation in medical circles. Soon, pharmacies in Europe and America were filled with tinctures, extracts, and pills based on cannabis indica. Pharmaceutical companies like Parke-Davis and Eli Lilly established their industrial production, purchasing tons of raw material from India. Cannabis entered the British and American pharmacopoeias as an official medicinal drug. Doctors prescribed it for migraines, insomnia, menstrual pain, asthma, and dozens of other ailments. This was the renaissance of cannabis as a medicine, its triumphant return to Western medicine. Simultaneously, it entered Bohemian culture, becoming a symbol of rebellion against bourgeois boredom. In 1840s Paris, the Club des Hachichens, which included Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, Charles Baudelaire, and Théophile Gautier, held meetings to experiment with dawamesque, a sweet Eastern delicacy made with hashish. Their florid, exotic, image-filled descriptions of an artificial paradise formed a romantic and simultaneously frightening image of hashish in the European consciousness. The plant became fashionable, mysterious, and slightly wicked. The tension between medical and recreational use grew with each decade. On the one hand, cannabis was a respectable medicine in a pharmacy bottle, available by a doctor's prescription. On the other, it was increasingly associated with bohemians, colonial natives, the criminal underworld, and social decay. At the end of the 19th century, the British administration in India, concerned by rumors about the harm of ganja to the population, established the large-scale Indian Hemp Drugs Commission. Its findings, published after several years of painstaking work and interviews with thousands of witnesses, surprised many. Moderate consumption, the commission concluded, is practically harmless, and a complete ban would do far more harm than good, pushing people toward more dangerous substances like opium or alcohol. This was the voice of reason and pragmatism, based on facts. But the 20th century chose to listen to another voice, the loud, hysterical voice of fear. The beginning of the 20th century brought waves of migration and an unprecedented rise in racial tension in the USA. After the Mexican Revolution of 1910, thousands of Mexicans, fleeing poverty and violence, poured into the southwestern U.S., bringing with them their culture, language, and the habit of smoking marijuana. In the eyes of the white Anglo-Saxon majority, this became a symbol of a foreign, dangerous threat. Newspapers, especially William Randolph Hearst's media empire, launched a targeted campaign portraying marijuana as the assassin's drug that caused madness, uncontrollable violence, and sexual promiscuity, especially among colored people. Mexicans, and African Americans. The jazz culture of Harlem and New Orleans, where musicians, many of them black, smoked reefer for inspiration, only added fuel to the fire of racist panic. The plant, which for centuries had been a medicine and a raw material, was transforming before their eyes into a social demon, a scapegoat for all the fears and prejudices of the era. The chief architect of this demonic transformation was Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, established in 1930. Fanatical, obsessed, incredibly ambitious, and possessing a genius talent for smear campaigns, Anslinger made the fight against marijuana his life's work and career. After the repeal of prohibition, his agency was left without an enemy, and marijuana became the ideal candidate for this role. He inundated Congress and the press with horrific, often completely fabricated stories about crimes committed under the influence of the killer weed. His rhetoric was steeped in venomous xenophobia and racism. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug, he proclaimed. Most of its users are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. The culmination of this campaign was the propaganda film Reefer Madness, 1936, which, with the gravity of a documentary, depicted how a single puff turns decent American teenagers into maniacs, rapists, and murderers. An atmosphere of moral panic was created. In 1937, with virtually no serious debate or scientific consultation, the U.S. Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act. Formally, it did not ban, but merely imposed a prohibitive tax on the sale of cannabis. But in practice, it meant a complete and total prohibition. Doctors who tried to object were intimidated and ignored. The American Medical Association opposed the law, stating that marijuana was a valuable medicine and that scientific evidence of its harm was absent, but its voice was drowned out in the chorus of hysteria. The prohibition of cannabis in the U.S. became a signal for the entire world. Under powerful pressure from Washington, which used the levers of diplomacy and financial aid, one country after another introduced similar draconian laws. In 1961, the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs definitively solidified the global ban, placing cannabis in Schedule 4, the category for the most dangerous drugs with no medical value, alongside heroin. The Iron Curtain had fallen. The plant that had been a companion, provider, and healer to humanity for 10,000 years was declared enemy number one. The consequences were swift and catastrophic. Millions of people around the world, the vast majority of them members of poor and marginalized groups, especially racial minorities, were thrown in prison for possessing a few grams of weed. Scientific research into its medical potential was frozen for decades. Traditional cultures in India, Jamaica, and Africa, where cannabis was an integral part of rituals and folk medicine, were forcibly criminalized. And control over the vast multi-billion-dollar black market passed entirely into the hands of organized crime, cartels, and the mafia, who began to earn fabulous sums of money from the prohibition. The war on drugs, officially declared by President Nixon in 1971, in reality, turned into a war on its own people. But even in the darkest times of prohibition, when the plant was struck from pharmacopoeias and entered into criminal codes, quiet, persistent work continued beneath the surface. In 1964 in Israel, at the Weizmann Institute, a young Bulgarian chemist named Raphael Mikulam made a breakthrough that would change everything. After receiving 5 kilograms of confiscated Lebanese hashish from the police, he managed for the first time in history to isolate, describe the chemical structure of, and synthesize the main psychoactive component of cannabis, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. It was like finding the key to a lock that had been locked for thousands of years. The work of McCollum and his followers led to an even more stunning discovery. In the late 1980s, scientists discovered that an entire signaling system of receptors exists in the human brain and throughout the body, perfectly suited for the THC molecule, like a key to a lock. This system was named the endocannabinoid system. It turned out that our own bodies constantly produce substances similar to cannabinoids. They were named anandamide, from the Sanskrit ananda, bliss, and 2-ag, that regulate virtually all fundamental processes: pain, appetite, memory, sleep, mood, the immune system, and inflammation. It was a biological revolution. It became clear that cannabis is not just a foreign toxin, but a key capable of interacting with the most complex regulatory system of our body, the conductor of our homeostasis. While scientists in laboratories were discovering its incredible medical potential, another movement was growing on the streets, a desperate resistance movement. In the 1980s and 90s, the AIDS epidemic was claiming thousands of lives, turning young, vibrant people into emaciated skeletons. Patients suffering from wasting syndrome, excruciating nausea from toxic medications, weight loss, and terrible neuropathic pain, discovered that smoking marijuana was often the only thing that brought them relief, restored their appetite, and allowed them to live another day. In San Francisco, true heroes of this movement emerged, such as Dennis Peron and Brownie Mary Rathbun, who, risking their freedom, created underground buyers clubs to supply dying patients with medicine. Their arrests and trials drew public attention to the absurdity and cruelty of a law that criminalized people trying to alleviate unbearable suffering. The culmination of this selfless struggle was the passage of California's Proposition 215 in 1996, the world's first law to legalize the use of cannabis for medical purposes upon a doctor's recommendation. The ice was broken. California's example was followed by other states and then countries: Canada, Israel, Germany. The wall of a century-long prohibition began to show deep cracks. In 2012, the states of Colorado and Washington went even further, doing the unthinkable. Through a popular referendum, they legalized cannabis not only for medical, but also for recreational use by adults. They were followed by Uruguay in 2013 and Canada in 2018, which became the first countries in the world to fully legalize the plant at a national level. Today, we live in an era of a great turning point, a tectonic shift. The world is slowly, with great difficulty and endless contradictions, emerging from a century-long era of total prohibition. This process gives rise to a host of very complex questions. How to regulate the market to avoid repeating the predatory mistakes of the tobacco and alcohol industries. How to ensure strict quality control and product safety. How to repair the colossal social and human damage that the war on drugs has inflicted on millions of people and entire communities. Social equity programs, which attempt to give an advantage in the new legal industry to those who suffered most from prohibition, and the mass expungement of convictions for nonviolent drug offenses, are just the first tentative steps on the long road to healing deep historical wounds. The modern cannabis industry is a wild, chaotic, bubbling world where the idealism of old activists clashes with the cold cynicism of Wall Street corporations, where cutting-edge science battles age-old prejudices and politicians try to find a delicate balance between public health, personal freedom, and enormous tax revenues. From tiny organic farms to giant agro holdings with city-sized greenhouses, from dispensaries selling oils and capsules measured to the milligram to vibrant shops offering hundreds of varieties of flour, beverages, chocolates, and gummies. This new world is being born in turmoil right before our eyes. Science continues to uncover ever new facets of the endocannabinoid system. Today, medicines based on CBD, another non-psychoactive cannabinoid, have already been approved for the treatment of rare and severe forms of childhood epilepsy. Promising research is underway into its potential for treating anxiety, chronic pain, inflammation, Parkinson's disease, PTSD, and even some types of cancer. But along with the huge potential, there are also real risks. The effect on the developing adolescent brain, the problem of driving under the influence, and the possibility of developing psychological dependence in predisposed individuals. The history of cannabis is a mirror that reflects all the complexity, tragedy, and hope of human nature. We took this plant to weave ropes and sew sails, to build civilizations. We used it to treat illnesses and speak with gods, to look beyond the mundane. We smoked it to relax after a hard day. And we declared war on it, imprisoning entire generations of our own citizens. It has been a commodity, a medicine, a sacrament, and a crime. Today, at this historic crossroads, we have a chance to write a new chapter. A chapter based not on fear and ignorance, as in the 20th century, but on science, compassion, and justice. The future is not predetermined. It is woven from the millions of decisions we are making right now. How we vote, what laws we pass, what research we fund, and how we decide to right the monstrous mistakes of the past. The path we choose will determine whether this plant becomes a symbol of a new, more rational and humane era, or just another commodity on the shelf of a global supermarket. History is watching us, and it, as always, will record everything.